Well, hello, everyone out there. Yeah, just Michael Fisher here for an evening of getting a little bit of reading done and thinking, well, I might as well read to some folks that might want to listen to this. And reason is I've got uh, one particular paper I want to show and particularly read it through for you so that you get a sense of where I was in 2002 as a fear researcher, educator. And that I will introduce shortly. In the meantime, I just wanted to say I'm reading this book right now. I highly recommend it. Beyond Psychology, Otto Rank, published in 1941. This book was his sort of last in a legacy of many books and many articles. He's a psychoanalyst, post-Freudian. He split off. He was Freud's so-called star pupil of many of Freud's, Sigmund Freud's, discipline disciples at the time, probably 1920s, 30s, and earlier even. Carl Jung, another one who split off, Adler, on and on. But everything I've read about Otto Rank, he was very core, and most people have never heard of Otto Rank, not like a Carl Jung who became very famous. And so why I want to just mention that book is I see this dude, Otto Rank, uh, just reading 3 or 4 chapters now. He died in 1939, and he left some amazing work. If you really want to dig into it, it's a little hard getting into for sure. But he was really taking psychoanalysis and a critique within that of psychology and psychoanalysis itself. Yeah, he's got that nice critical reflective. And then he takes it basically into some very nice analysis of fear at a very deep level. And I've been calling him the proto fear analysis of the Western world just recently because of my insights into this. So, as you or may or not know, I've been developing for 3 decades plus this idea of fear analysis, which I call analogous to psychoanalysis, but also very different than psychoanalysis, but a lot of overlaps with psychoanalysis. I'm trying to give this recognition of a methodology and approach. And it's a philosophy behind it that there is a fear analysis that's required for our entire planet. And I sort of was just recently writing today that that fear analysis leads to a new fear story. You heard of history, right? You've heard of some of the feminists say, well, we need to have a herstory. And I'm coming along and basically playing off that critique and saying we need a fear story, a fear story. Okay, enough on Otto Rank and fear analysis. But in my work, this paper I found recently, you can see it's a single spaced. I don't know how long it'll take to read this. It's double spaced is what I mean. And it's not a long paper, but I submitted it on January 24, 2002. It was called Fear Forum, #1. And fear I have in scare marks, which is kind of my specialty of how we need to think of fear anew and with a sense of mystery of something more than we already know about fear. Fear. And the thematic topics, see, I had this dream for a series called Fear Forums. And this topic is called Terrorism Post 9/11 and Education. I do a sci-fi interview in my mind of a forum or a panel where I'm sitting on and we're talking about fear. So I wanted to gather the best people around me that I could think of. So I've been reading a lot, right? I was in the middle of my PhD right here at UBC in education faculty, trying to bring this forward, this topic, and get some dialogue, some new discussion. But I can't find the people, right? I can't find people to have that in-depth discussion with me for all kinds of reasons. And perhaps they're just afraid of talking about fear too much. And I was picking that up, and it's very frustrating. So, typical of even a frustrated child, if you can't talk to your parents or your sibs in the way that you would like to talk to or engage the world the way you'd like to, you start making up invisible friends and you have invisible conversations. And I kind of feel like I was doing that. So in 2000, I would have been exactly 50 years old. And here I am, looking for invisible friends, have conversations on the topic of fear. So let's go into it. I'll just read to you. You can lay back, have a cup of tea, listen to this in more than one session if you want, if you don't want to listen to it all at once. But I'm going to read the whole thing, that whole damn thing, because I just think it's so important that the world has a chance to hear conversations, even if they're made up, coming from me, a budding fearologist, interviewing people like, yeah, who's going to be in this forum? Well, I picked Noam Chomsky. I picked Parker J. Palmer. I picked Gavin DeBecker, and a couple others you'll hear come in to the conversation. So here we go. I said at this time I was a PhD candidate, had not received. His research work has focused on violence and an interdisciplinary study of the role of conflict and fear in pedagogical theory and practices. His specialty is that of being a fear critic. Fear Forum 1, number 1. Fear Forums is a series of thought experiments, fiction based on real characters, sponsored by the virtual Fear Watch Institute, founded by R. Michael Fisher. Fear Forums is part of an ongoing educational dialogue that examines the role of fear in society. Following is a short excerpt from Fear Forum number 1 with a focus on education. Fear Forum number 1 includes several fear experts: Dr. Noam Chomsky from MIT, Dr. Parker Palmer, founder of the Center for Teacher Education, Gavin DeBecker of Gavin DeBecker Incorporated Security, Dr. Barry Glasner, a University of Southern California sociologist, and Kay Gilley, International Leadership Systems. She was an organizational consultant. So those are all real people with real positions in the real world that I'm inviting into this fictional conversation. This is my dream forum in a way, or at least one of them. From a darkened room, a panel of scholarly-looking men and women's faces hypnotically light up with flickering reflections from the movie screen. The closing scenes of the action sci-fi movie The Matrix, 1999, project to the front of the room. Suddenly, the movie screen itself shows black with flashing phosphorescent light green square cursor in the upper left corner. It is the year 2199, actually. The transformed protagonist of the movie, Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, once a fearful rebel hacker, now fearless warrior, gives his final speech in near complete darkness. Neo knows that his words are being monitored by the deadly agents of the Matrix. He challenges their violence, authority, and the virtual reality that AI machines have created for their enslaved programmed humans. He says, this is really from that film, 1999, The Matrix. I know you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you are afraid. You are afraid of us. You are afraid of change. ... End of movie. Number 1 of a trilogy, eventually a 4th film done just past year, 21, 22. The movie stops and the lights come up in the room as the panel members stretch and ponder the movie narrative. A current of anticipation spills over in spontaneous conversations and concerned gestures. Water is passed around the table as the panel facilitators stand to greet the participants. Fisher. Welcome to Fear Forum number 1. What is the Matrix? I trust the film has stirred up your thoughts and feelings about how we live our lives today in a postmodern world, a simulacrum, a prison for the mind. That is continually becoming more virtual than real. Albeit somewhat extreme, the Wachowski brothers' futurist film, The Matrix, is loaded with applicable and revealing metaphors about the tragedy of human life today that could be analyzed for a long time. Dr. Fred Ribkoff, an English professor, and I have concluded that Matrix is a construct of fear that is designed to control humans via an enslavement that makes them feel a certain security and safety without seeing the cost they pay. By the way, Fred Ribkoff was an English PhD at the same time I was working on mine, and we did actually collaborate and watch that movie The Matrix, many, many times and started writing an article which we never finished. Kudos to Fred Ribkoff, wherever he is today. Back then in 2002, we were buds. The construct of fear helps us more or less forget traumatic memories that terrify the soul of our being. The Holocaust, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Cold War, American global bullying, the disappearing ozone layer, and so on. The fear construct, or architecture of fear, of contemporary society is a massive trance or defense mechanism that does not allow us to see the ways that the low-grade chronic fear constructs their very identity and reality we experience. As a cultural critic, Dr. Brian Massumi has argued this case. Massumi argued, he's a philosopher, a Canadian philosopher, that fear is part of an economic matrix, as we are all trapped in what he called, quote, an organized fear trade, quote. Most of the fear Massumi and I are talking about is not recognized as fear, but as something normal, as what the critic educator Dr. Peter McLaren argued is, quote, a new species of fear, end quote. Certainly more than just a feeling or an emotion as biologists and psychologists would have us believe about fear. My own doctoral research is on redefining fear in a much larger interdisciplinary manner, I now call it transdisciplinary, in order to better understand what is going on. The world is a fear matrix, and we are all in it, more or less. Neo in the film finally sees through the illusion at one point of his normal life in the fear matrix, my term, and momentarily turns the power tables upside down, exposing the dominant agents as the ones who are really most afraid rather than the rebels. You got to watch the film. The film points toward the importance of human freedom through recognizing a system of institutions, practices, and leaders who operate on and in fear virtually all the time. I tend to agree with Aung San Suu Kyi, political dissident leader from Burma, now Myanmar, and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, that it is, quote, not power that corrupts, but fear, end quote. Parker J. Palmer, an educational leader who is with us on our panel today, has said something very similar, I believe, when he wrote, quote, fear gives ignorance its power. He actually really did say that, as did Aung San Suu Kyi. Since the 9/11 tragedy and the US declared war on terror, in quotes, it is pretty clear that our world is not becoming less fearful with progress, but more terrified by more things. According to Dr. Frank Peretti, a British sociologist, quote, safety has become the fundamental value of the 1990s. Passions that were once devoted to a struggle to change the world or to keep it the same are now invested in trying to ensure that we are safe, end quote. This personal safety priority of most people in the highly industrial developed world has its shadow side. For example, sociologists of the culture of fear, like Peretti and Dr. Barry Glasner, who is also with us today on the panel, are suggesting that fear is rampant, but unfortunately it is focused by media and political propagandists, fearmongers, onto, quote, the wrong things, while distracting the civil society from more important concerns that we ought to fear and do something about. For example, growing economic disparity between the rich and the poor, unclean water, children starving to death, and so on. Regardless of what is most important to fear, it seems that there was a prophecy that has come true in Albert Camus' poetic 1943 vision. That's actually 1946, I rechecked that. Is his underground French resistance newspaper article, Combat, was the name of the magazine. Camus wrote beautifully as an existentialist philosopher poet would. Here's the lines. I love these. I repeat them often in many publications. The 17th century was the century of mathematics. The 18th century was of physical sciences, and the 19th biology. Our 20th century is the century of fear, end quote. You really think about that quote, whoa, it means a lot, says a lot for us to really reflect on. So it looks like the 21st century, me speaking now, is the century of terror. So where do we go after that? It looks pretty grim. This pattern ought to make us very critical of what is called education progress culture, civilization, etc. I've said enough in general to get this discussion started. Let me focus now on the beginning of our dialogue around a few questions. Number one, is there paranoia as conspiracy theory in my own analysis of the fear matrix? And is that useful? Number two, is there a need for, quote, a little paranoia, end quote, amongst educators today as we contemplate the future of schools, colleges, and departments of education, as Burbach and Lafleur, 2001, have argued recently in an issue of Action in Teacher Education? And three, is the safe schools, communities movement a reality or dangerous fantasy after 9/11? And four, another question, there's a couple more. How will we know when fear, quote, is working for us and not against us, end quote, as Lair and Martin, 1994, asked teachers? And number five, what theories and ideas do educators of teachers draw upon to deal with the current situation of so much fear in their classrooms and in public teachers' classrooms of young students? What sources would be helpful to them? I've attempted here to collect together in the Fear Forum some of the best minds who tackle the fear problems of this world from many different perspectives. I think all teachers today, public or private, ought to familiarize themselves with these thinkers and their ideas. Fear Forums is based on the same basic thesis of world perspectives, which is an actual forum group of international brightest minds kind of thing in the mid-1950s. Yeah, which brought together our greatest thinkers around the world to better understand and attempt to resolve the global problematique, as they called it, and published many books based on, quote, a fresh vision of reality. This thesis, in short, by Ruth Anshin, who is one of the kind of director coordinators of that World Perspective series, 1956, wrote this. I just excerpted a part of it, a really good essay she writes, that are in all the series of books of what's called World Perspectives. She writes that man is in the process of developing a new consciousness, which, in spite of his apparent spiritual and moral captivity, can eventually lift the human race above and beyond the fear, ignorance, and isolation which beset it today. So that was one of the aims of World Perspective. Okay, back to me. That was almost 50 years ago, and I don't think much has changed. So add another 25 years onto that nearly. Fear was number one concern in the human global problematique, according to Ann Shen in that quote. In fear forums, I'm not looking for pat answers. I'm looking more for dialogue on fear itself that is typically not happening in our educational and political halls. This panel dialogue is not likely going to be linear and clear or end in a neat synopsis. Be prepared for uncertainty, ambiguity, non-linearity of cause and effect, all kinds of mysterious things in the real world. Back to me. There are many different perspectives on the complex problems of fear in our world, and I suspect no more controversial than within the context of public education. I recall Dr. Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and political activist at MIT, has written on the quote, culture of fear and terror in Colombia. He used those words. And he has also argued that the sciences are having to admit that, quote, reality is just too much of a mess, end quote, to oversimplify and be smug about. If I had to put a footnote on there today, I'd say, and be so rational about it, as if. Dr. Chomsky, you have written on public education and threats to it as well. Would you like to start our dialogue? But remember that I may have to cut you off to give other panel members a chance to speak, as you are the one called the rebel without a pause, and to quote, that's from somebody. And Noam Chomsky also is somebody who talks a lot. Once you get him started. Here we go in the first dialogue, 2002. Here we go. This comes after reading lots of all these people I interview and in these scientific fictional so-called dialogues. I've read their work and I've studied their work, so I'm trying to stick true to them as well, but I'm also filling in this nuance of human to human communication in my imaginary friends. Chomsky. Who said that about me? Rebel without a pause, that idea. Fisher. One of your fans. Actually, it was Bono of the pop music group U2. Chomsky. Another rebel. More charismatic than I would want to be, but I do talk a lot when I do get going, he admits. Fisher. For many lefties, you are the secular guiding light, very persuasive in your truth-telling. According to David Barsamin, Minion of Alternative Radio, he calls you the new left secular, quote, rabbi, preacher, rinpoche, pundit, sensei. Very spiritual language, end quote. Chomsky says, David is more than kind. It is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. But I'm not interested to persuade people charismatically. I'd rather persuade them to find out the truth for themselves, beyond what media and most authorities tell us is the truth. Maybe I am successful in persuading some people to be skeptical, and I would hope that includes being skeptical of my assertions. I hadn't seen The Matrix before. The Matrix concept in the movie reminded me of Janice Stein's notion of, quote, cult of efficiency, end quote, in her recent book. That force today, which has harnessed so much of human creativity, freedom, and certainly we see it harnessing our public education systems and making a lot of people conform to this new cult. Fisher. Your own public schooling wasn't all that positive, right? Chomsky. My intellectual achievement was retarded when I went to a high-achieving public high school. My natural curiosity and creativity was buried under the imposed pressures to fit into the mold, behave, stop really thinking critically and originally, and don't cause any trouble. I see this way of schooling has consumed most people today so that much when some new event like free trade, for example, comes along, the population as a whole cannot think independently about what is being hijacked and sold to us under the guise of so-called, quote, reforms, end quote. Then there is the play with language in the Matrix, where we are told the fairy tale economy is based on a, quote, flexible market, labor market, end quote, which hides the real meaning that workers have no more real job security and ought not expect it anymore. Here is where fear is perpetrating a great advantage for the elite owning classes. If people are afraid they don't have job security, if they have a fear of job loss, which is one of the consequences of the mislabeled free trade agreements, and there's a flexible labor market, meaning you don't have security, the people, the workers, are not going to ask for better conditions and benefits generally. The cult of efficiency is really nasty here. Part of the genius of the system of domination and control is to separate people from one another in the name of efficiency so that people don't think critically together much about social problems anymore. It is a cult of keeping people stupid and even convincing us all that there is an educational crisis, quotes, beginning in the mid-1980s, and we ought to be all afraid that there's an educational crisis, and thus we ought to turn over our public education systems to more effective private operators. A lot of fear and a lot of propaganda is what I've seen in these debates. Fisher. Somebody up there is manufacturing consent via fear. Ought not educators be a little more paranoid to protect their public institutions, as Burbach and Lafleur have argued recently? But I have red flags go up when I hear any educational leaders promoting paranoia, like Burbach and Lafleur, even if they say, quote, you need a little paranoia, end quote, amongst educators overall. Or has everything changed since 9/11 and the war on terror, I ask? Chomsky. First, I've written in my new book, 9/11, that's the title, that Laden and all the global networks of terror, as Stein calls them, are mainly designed to breed within and upon the reservoirs of anger and fear in many countries that oppose U.S. foreign policies and actions. The U.S. has long been part of these networks of terror with their own versions of terrorism. The war on terror doesn't exist. It is a misnomer and it is nothing new. There is no war on terrorism. That is like one terrorist group saying It is against terrorism and declares a war on itself and their own basic power strategies. There are terror networks against terror networks all over the globe trying to dominate public opinion and control resources and power. Who gets to have a legitimate terrorist network and who doesn't is really the issue of power we ought to be analyzing, not a war on terror. Terrorism has become so interwoven with war and politics and human history that they are virtually inseparable, and no one nation is innocent. It's hard not to be paranoid, but maybe we can be a more informed paranoid than a lesser informed paranoid. We ought to utilize education, the best kind, where people are encouraged to think for themselves critically, to take time to analyze things before jumping to quick fixes. Then maybe the propaganda that the US leaders and others like Layden are spreading won't catch fire so hotly and get out of our control so easily. That is the role for educators of all kinds. But first, educators, and especially a lot of elite American educators and leaders, will have to take a look at the history of war and education in this country. In the book, Propaganda in the Public Mind, I made a case against some US presidents and educators like John Dewey and his circle during World War I, as they bought British propaganda and were pro-war supporters, covered over with a chorus of self-adulation that makes one's stomach turn. I said in that book that, quote, intellectuals are both the main victims of the propaganda system and also its main architects, end quote. So I could support the wake-up call of Burbach and Lafleur put out to the educators today in order to survive privatization, but also they also have to equally emphasize their own place in the privileged intellectual discourses that construct fear to create propaganda too. As long as they have self-doubts about their own initiatives of increasing, quote, a little paranoia, end quote, then I don't think it is a bad idea. But fear and violence are close comrades, and even the best intentions to create one create the other. History records that relationship pretty well. Fisher. Dr. Palmer, you have written that, quote, education's nemesis is not ignorance, but fear, end quote. Palmer. I have canvassed most all of my educational career as a student, a teacher, as an educational consultant, in most of the books I write, to ensure that fear is challenged and eliminated, or at least minimized from learning. We don't need it. Children don't need it to be good students either. We have to critically question the way adults rationalize the value of fear, which is very different in its biological form to protect us from real dangers and its cultural form, which disables us. There is no reason for fear other than someone is using it to control others, and you can guess who that is. But I'm not just talking about teachers and their administrators using fear to control others in less privileged positions. I'm talking about what the students learn from this culture of fear that we adults have created. I mean the students that terrify us in our classrooms, the ones we call the students from hell, the ones we often write off and ignore because they scare us in their resistance, but it's subtle, like not paying attention to a word we say, or be it overt, when they take up arms and threaten or kill somebody. Fisher. Fear creates the isolation and the cult of efficiency, don't you think? Palmer. Yes, I agree with Dr. Chomsky. From grade school on, education is a fearful enterprise, and the born love of learning turns so often to hate the idea of schooling and learning. The external structures of education would not have the power to divide us as deeply as they do if they were not rooted in one of the most compelling features of our inner landscape, fear. We end up as teachers and parents collaborating with the elite powers and politicians in their reforms because they so successfully exploit fear, fear that public schools are failing us and we aren't efficient enough, and so on and so on. There's far too much paranoia in education, in my view. I don't agree with adding a little more paranoia, like Burbach and Lafleur have argued. I'm very skeptical when they, like any educational leaders, tend to follow business philosophies and apply them to education uncritically. Fisher. I am concerned as well. Burbach and Lafleur have some 60 years combined experience in education of teachers, and they turned to a book entitled Only the Paranoid Survive, 1999, by Andy Groves, the former CEO of Intel Corp. and promote fear amongst educators. Plummer. If they, Burback and Lafleur, think people need to be awakened, why don't they try love instead of fear as the catalyst to get things going and to protect public schools? My experience is that the complacency, ignorance, and the arrogance Burback and Lafleur have experienced in the professional educational community are merely forms of fear, and trying to induce fear to overcome fear is a very dubious strategy. It is like the American leadership today using terror to fight the war on terror. It only breeds more terror in an endless cycle of fear. And I know that desperation usually leads us to use fear and follow fear because we've rationalized it as the only way out to survive or be efficient. But I question if survival is really the aim of the kind of cultural fear that is being created and reproduced in our educational theories and practices. We have to look deeply at our motivations. I'll quote from something I wrote a few years back. Like many organizers, I was schooled in the style of leadership based on allies and enemies. Find your allies and make common cause with them. Then use your collective power to marginalize and defeat the enemy. What we needed as organizers was not an allies versus enemies strategy based on surface fears, for that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We needed a strategy built on people's deeper, unarticulated hopes. We knew that fear fades when people meet the stranger, enemy, and learn not only that the stranger lacks horns, but that they even become bearers of gifts. End of quote. Fisher. I agree in principle, Parker, but I'm not so confident all enemies are so benign. Anyway, Gavin DeBecker is with us and comes from the security and risk assessment field with an expertise on the impact of fear. Gavin, you have likely something to offer us when we as educators start looking at strategies that create fear to solve fear. DeBecker. It is imperative that we clarify terms when we speak of fear. After studying fear for some 30 years and all the writing I've published on it, there seems to be a necessary distinction to make. True fear is a natural signal of danger, and we ought to be listening to it a lot more than we do. Unwarranted fear is less helpful and has to do with constructions of fear in our imagination and by our media and so on. My book, Fear Less, semicolon, treat truth about risk, safety, and security in a time, real truth, about risk, safety, and security in a time of terrorism, continues the theme of my work to address ways to put fear experience into perspective. And right now, we are at a peak fear point in our world, and a little rational perspective would help us out a good deal so as to not let unwarranted fear get the better of us, as it often does. I've learned through experience that fear is often its own monster and carries its own terrorizing threat all by itself. Fisher. Culturally constructed fear. That is internalized and thus unwarranted often. DeBecker. Yes. All kinds of organizations benefit from this unwarranted fear. I think Dr. Masumi, as you said in your introduction, is onto something when he claims there's an organized fear trade. The quick reactive problem with most adults, and I include educators, comes when they deal with terrifying situations where their safety and security is threatened, tend to exaggerate the facts or misuse facts and gather a storm of emotional hype to persuade and make changes that in the long run are not very helpful because they are so poorly thought out, as Dr. Chomsky has indicated how fear makes us easily conform and leave little room for critical evaluation. Good risk analysis cannot be driven by unwarranted fear, which often doesn't get acknowledged. Fear is actually denied consciously, and what looks, quote, rational, end quote, and fearless is anything but. After a thing, for example, an event like Columbine or Oklahoma City, and now after 9/11, fear is in such a hurry to be soothed that it will take the first train that comes along, and it doesn't matter if it's headed where we want to go, because that's where we're going. Fisher. The existential philosopher Hans Jonas has written some very interesting thoughts about the importance of a, quote, heuristics of fear, end quote, as the basis for ethics today in a postmodern technological world, where we ought to incorporate fear in our decisions about the future, but do it consciously, not unconsciously. He recommended true fear has a teaching value that some choices like nuclear power, when we're under consideration, ought to be considered as dangerous, terrifying, with too much risk to go ahead with because of potential failures and consequences in the future. Western man, in his arrogance and bravery, too often ignores and denies true fear as a gift and signals to stop what we are doing and take another critical look. A heuristics of fear, however, is a way to challenge progress at any cost, so called. Fear ought to be an ingredient to planning, but it is not paranoia. Jonas is not saying be a quote little paranoid end quote. I would recommend Jonas to Burback and Lure. Jonas is not talking about de Becker's fear train, which is heading for who to blame and who to punish de Becker. Unfortunately, that seems to be the American way. Nothing gets attention as reliably as fear. Nature designed it that way, but we abuse it culturally and politically. Unwarranted fear is a curse because it distracts us from what is really happening. That is our national tragedy. Barry Glasner. I started my book, The Culture of Fear, Why Americans Are Afraid of the Wrong Things, along that line of our national tragedy. I wanted to know why so many fears in the air are so unfounded but get so much hyper attention. Every few days we find a new fear, some flesh-eating virus, some new category of people to fear, some new criminal or granny to doing crack herself. The reality is that the more things improve, the more pessimistic we become. And that is leading to a very disturbing attitude in the American public mind. Fearmongers have knocked the optimism out of us by stuffing us full of negative presumptions about our fellow citizens and social institutions. We waste tens of millions of dollars and personal hours every year on largely mythical hazards. Becker responds. 90% of a broad spectrum of Americans polled in 1997 believed that they feel less safe today than when they were growing up. Glasner. Exactly. It will be interesting to watch what post 9/11 does to change this pessimism toward progress. Americans are pretty rallied up to storm ahead under a renewed patriotism, but I don't think it will last long. We had better learn to doubt our inflated fears before they destroy us. The Becker is quite correct on this. Just a little insert there, obviously the US went to war against Iraq in 2003, which would be a year after I wrote this paper. And so things are not as pretty as Glasner thought maybe it would improve. Fisher. One of the mythical hazards that is most incalcitrant in the American historical, political, and military consciousness, or is it paranoia, is that the world needs Americans to lead democracy and the good life for all, the American way, of course. Globalization is a huge problem today, and backed up by its share of elite fearmongers and terror to hold us together, this, quote, one world, new world order, end quote, we are seeing an absurd situation that John Robbins, founder of EarthSave International and an American citizen, has so aptly written. I quote his latest article. In 1998, the United Nations Development Program estimated that it would cost an additional $9 billion above current expenditures to provide clean water and sanitation for everyone on Earth. It would cost an additional $12 billion to cover reproductive health services for all women worldwide. Another $13 billion would be enough not only to give every person on Earth food to eat, but also basic health care. An additional $6 billion would provide basic education for all. These are large numbers, but combined, they add up to $40 billion. Only 1/5 as much as the $200 billion the US government agreed to pay Lockheed to build new F-35 Joint Strike Fighter jets. End quote by Robbins. Robbins mentions that the initial military response to 9/11 is easily $100 billion. When I read Robbins' article to my two late teenage daughters, they were outraged. But then they went down to their rooms and watched the latest episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer on TV. Robbins concluded that, quote, If we are serious about stopping terrorism, then our goal must be to reduce the level of pollution, fear, and poverty in the world. End of quote. Kay Gilley is an organizational consultant. She is author of several books and has an important experience and ideas around fear in organizations. Gilley. I'm not sure I have anything more important than what has already been said. Robbins' figures say it all in a way. The path of fear, as I call it, is obviously well recorded in military spending in America relative to spending on education or health. The less obvious is, what are we to do about it? In my first book, I talked about the quote corporate trance that is based on fear. I argued that any organization or set of relationships has to make friends with the dark side within us, where the paranoia begins. All that we have to accept about ourselves isn't love and beauty. Each of us is there as a dark side, fear, righteousness, judgment. The dark side unconsciously drives us to plot, to calculate, and control so that our dark secret remains a secret. We develop strategies to keep others from discovering this secret, this fear inside. Strategies like perfectionism, control mania, all with the best of intentions, of course. These are all fear-driven strategies that keep us from our place of peace and keep us on the path of fear. They separate us and keep us from risking doing our best job. My own life story taught me much of these lessons. After a year of working 60 plus hours per week, hardly seeing my husband and friends, and being bored stiff, I realized that what I was creating was what I feared most. I wanted to be creative and doing leading edge work, but I was so exhausted that I wasn't creative. I was so controlled and controlling that I didn't try anything new. When I was able to recognize that perfectionism and controlomania were strategies for hiding self-doubt and fear about my ability to handle the outcomes, I was able to stop the behavior. I was learning to live in a conscious way. Fisher. I would really like to see some creative imagination in the ways American and Canadian leaders in all sectors respond to fear. If North America is to be some kind of moral model for the rest of the world, that is where we have to do some serious homework yet. Gilly. U.S. organizations are managed largely from unacknowledged and unspoken fear. Unwarranted fear, as Gavin de Becker would say, this fear is not conducive to a springing forth of spirit in its full glory to guide the organization and those within it to be their very best. Until leaders are willing to let go of their fear and discover the courage of their hearts, our workplaces and our world will continue to stifle fresh creativity, imagination, and new solutions to our problems. The entire total quality management revolution, based on Deming's leadership, emphasized the principle of no fear management. Without that principle, we are doomed to fail over and over in our lack of courage to face our fear-driven decision-making habits. That's what Parker Palmer was alluding to earlier. Fisher. Ethics and spirit based on fearlessness seem imperative. The dialogue continues. ... There were 16 pages, another 3 pages of footnotes and notes going into details and giving backup to the references to that dialogue. So I don't know what you think, beer folks, after listening to that. Just want to remind us all that was, over 21 years ago. Yeah. I put in my book proposal for my, not a book proposal, but it was my dissertation proposal for a study in my PhD in education. I handed it in 4 days before 9/11 hit. And it was all my proposal was to study this fear, culture of fear phenomenon, in the effect it has in education, creating violence, et cetera, et cetera. It was pretty negative about fear, the culturally constructed form, and what was happening in this movement for safe schools and safety first discourses in education. I thought were just missing the really deep understanding and the fear education that we needed. So I wrote that proposal. 9/11 hit, and I went, "Wow, okay." I didn't have any clue 9/11 was going to happen, like most people. And look what it did to our world. It just made it worse by far. in terms of the use of fear mongering strategies of all the kinds of things that these people talk about in this paper here. So in this paper, I did have the luxury of being a post 9/11, perspective, and even Noam Chomsky wrote a book called 9/11, and he also saw these major changes that would start a whole cycle that would be very hard to unwind, and have not unwound to this day. So here we are in 2023. I look forward to your comments on that article or anything else that I'm attempting to teach, and your support. I'm doing this work, gratis as a independent public scholar. So um, any kind of support, of course, helps. Let's keep this discussion, this dialogue, and this improvement of our fear education at this really deep sociological, psychological, spiritual levels, etc. Good night.